Designing user interfaces and experiences for VR. That's today's topic with Gabriel Valdivia. So let's get to it. You are listening to the How to Create VR podcast, weekly conversations with VR professional creators, designers, and producers. Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR podcast, where I speak with professional creators, designers, developers, and producers who work in VR, AR, and MR projects. I'm your host, Marcelo, founder of HowToCreateVR.com. We bring VR bootcamps to your company to help you and your employees get up to speed on VR. You can learn more at HowToCreateVR.com. My guest today is Gabriel Valdivia, a product designer at Jigsaw based in New York, currently exploring how technology and VR can make people safer. Prior to that, he explored social VR and content creation at Facebook and connected cars at Automatic. Today, Gabriel and I will be talking all about how to design user interfaces and user experiences in VR. Gabriel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad to have you here. I read a great article that you did, which we'll post in our show notes in Medium, I think it was. And it was all about UI and UX experiences or UX for VR. And I was so impressed, I told myself I got to get this guy on the podcast. So thank you for accepting and joining and being here today.
Oh, that's very nice of you. Thank you for the kind words.
So before we jump into the questions, we're going to be talking all about UI and UX in VR, but give us a little bit about your background.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been designing for about 15 years. I went to school for graphic design. So I spent a lot of my time worrying about branding and marketing and that side of things, and eventually quickly evolved to web design, mobile design, and spent the last 4 years at Facebook, and then transitioned to Google Daydream, and I am now at this alphabet incubator called Jigsaw. So I'm always kind of attracted by teams and products that use technology for behavior change, and that's kind of what has been my driving force thus far, and has allowed me to be exposed to the product that I've been.
So how did you make the jump from, because it sounds like you've been through it all, through print, electronic, web, and mobile, and now VR. How did you get into VR?
It was a very lucky set of circumstances for me. I was working on Facebook at a team that was focused on content creation. So we were working on the tools that people have to share on Facebook, just share photos, share status updates, and so on. So I worked on that for a couple of years, and I became really kind of enamored with the tools that people have to express themselves. And right around the time where Oculus was acquired by Facebook, I got really interested in that kind of next wave of formats that people would use to share their lives. So there was a small team called 360 Media on the Facebook side that was starting out, and they were exploring what 360 videos, how they could kind of like coexist on the Facebook newsfeed. And they wanted help with introducing 360 photos to that ecosystem. And I had spent the last couple of years working on, on that very same thing, and how people create photos on the platform. So it felt like a natural transition where I was able to focus on 360 photos and eventually kind of expand my knowledge to 360 media in low-end headsets, kind of like the Gear VR and kind of low input devices. And then after doing that for a while, I expanded to kind of touch-enabled products like Facebook Spaces. So it was pretty gradual for me to be exposed to different products around VR. And it started with the focus of how do we let people express themselves in a way that they haven't yet, or capture a moment and express that moment in new ways.
What was your first VR experience that you remember?
I don't really know the app. It was something around 360 photos, because that's what I was working on. But I remember very vividly that I was looking through some photosphere in an app, and I was really impressed by it. It was like a a landscape that was very impressive. And I remember viewing that and being very excited about that technology. And a few weeks later, I was browsing Facebook and I saw a photo for that place that I was in VR. And my immediate reaction to that was, oh, I've been there. And then I have to like catch myself and say, oh, wait, no, I wasn't there. I was in VR, right?
That's awesome.
and that moment really kind of made me fall in love with this idea that you could access these places or these experiences through VR and, keep a memory of it in a way that is as valid almost as if you were actually there.
Right. The experiential, right? I mean, that's the whole key with VR, and that's what they say is like people that go through that experience later on, it almost feels like it's a real memory of something you've really experienced.
Totally.
So it's very interesting. So what's your favorite VR experience as of today? I'm sure between then, your first 360 experience that you had, and to today, I'm sure you've tried a variety. What would you call your favorite? And it could be your favorite just because it's entertaining, or it could be because it's an awesome UI or UX experience. But which one is it?
Yeah, I've seen quite a lot that are really impressive. A lot of documentaries are really impressive. Even short films. I cried a lot during Dear Angelica.
Oh, yeah. That's an excellent one.
Yeah, but I think my favorite today is still this one called Notes on Blindness, which is a short experience based, I believe, on a feature film or a documentary that chronicles the kind of the life of this person who went blind halfway through his life, and then he recorded audio tapes of how he was starting to experience the world while he was blind. And you in VR, you can obscure your vision, and as this person kind of narrates how they're understanding the world, then the world itself starts to be painted for you in this experience. So he talks about like rain falling on a lake. So then he visualizes there's water nearby, right? And that idea that you can kind of hijack somebody's senses to let them experience the world in a perspective that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to was really impactful for me. And to this day, it's one of the ones that kind of touched me the most, because it gave me a whole lot of empathy for what it's like to be blind. But it also kind of like opened my eyes to see what this technology could do, right? It could show people new things in new ways that you can't in any other medium.
Definitely. I've tried that one too. I have it, and it's really a great experience. Another great empathy one is Becoming Homeless. I don't know if you've tried that out. The graphics aren't that great, but it does, it's all about empathy. And at the end of it, you come out with a much better understanding of homeless people.
Wow. Yeah. I'll write that down. I would love to see that.
It's definitely, it's great for learning empathy and the power of VR in empathy. So, but you wrote a great article. I mentioned that at the beginning, which, like I said, we're going to put it in the show notes so people can check it out. But what inspired you to write that article?
By virtue of being at Facebook, just being at Facebook, being exposed to the problems that company tackles with every day. I had the privilege of being kind of invited to a few conferences to speak, and I always kind of started those talks with an assumption that people understood what VR is, or that at least they were excited by it. As I was kind of wrapping up the year, I was kind of struck by this idea that some people might not care about VR, but they might not really think that it's something that's worth keeping on the radar. So I really asked myself, like, why is VR important? And because I see it as kind of an inevitable step in the way we think about content and design. But I imagine there are people that don't, right? There's people that think it might just be a fad, or the 3D TV equivalent. So my impetus here was to try to articulate why I thought, if not now, it will eventually be a kind of imminent step and inevitable, and to kind of express the implications that has on the way we design experiences, the way we think about content, and what we can do today to prepare ourselves for that moment when it comes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I highly recommend everybody to read it because it does give a great overview of not only why it's important, but things to look out for as a designer. And even if you're not a designer, if you're a producer, I mean, it's definitely a great overview. So let's talk about designing UX and UI for VR. How is that any different than, let's say, for mobile or a website or anything else, any other kind of medium?
Yeah, I think it depends on how you look at design. I think we have a temptation to become hyper-focused on an area of design. If you're a brand designer, you may take particular pride on, letter forms or certain shapes or color theory, and you may think that is your bread and butter. And similarly, if you're designing for mobile, you may think that figuring out the best sketch plugin or the best component to use in React is your bread and butter. And I think that you have that same kind of danger in the VR world to think that maybe you need to learn Unity and you need to learn all about colliders and shaders and all this stuff. And I see those as just outcomes of the principle of design, which is figuring out how this technology can help people solve problems. So under that sense, you can kind of draw a line between print all the way to VR, which again is around using design as a methodology, almost like the scientific method, to how to take a technology and apply it to a possible problem. So for VR, there's just more technologies to consider. In print, you have a few variables. Mobile kind of expands that a bit more, and with responsive web and all the different platforms for mobile. I think in VR, you have not only different platforms for VR, you have different input devices. You also have just more variables. You have sound and environments and physical safety that somebody might feel by being in a certain space. So as a designer, I think you need to think a little bit broader, and it's more about connecting dots between different specialists than becoming a specialist yourself. There are great 3D animators, there's great programmers and so on that you can use their skills in VR and tie them all through design. And by that, I mean by some sort of scientific method that finds a solution to a problem and kind of connects the dots from all the different practices into something that feels cohesive, and it is an experience that is worth having. So I see design in VR as an opportunity for a designer to think beyond pixels or beyond the screen and think about a more holistic experience from the moment somebody puts on the headset to the moment they take it off, right? And that really has an infinite set of experiences that you can have an influence on.
And that makes a lot of sense. In other mediums, you don't have like sense of presence where you do in VR. So how does UX design affect that? In other words, or maybe we can get more into the nitty-gritty technical details, but what are some things that are important from a design perspective to give that sense of presence or make that sense of presence more realistic?
Yeah, presence was something that we thought about a lot when designing social VR at Facebook. I think that there's a few different types of presence there, and you can go deeply on any of them. I think we generally thought of it as three kind of categories. There's one, which is your own presence, the idea that you have a body, you have hands that are tracked to your movement, you have an avatar that you configure and it represents you. That's a whole set of interesting design decisions that go into that one category. The other category is your friends, especially for a social experience. The fact that you have friends that you recognize, that you can interact with, that you feel are in a space with you, even though they may be far away in real life. And there's a whole set of considerations for that. And then the third category is presence in a space. So not the people in the space, but the space itself. The fact that it has some rules that you can intuit and you can, work around, and the fact that you may feel that you're in a certain place, just like I felt like I was in that, landscape on my first VR experience, like designing a space that feels comfortable, and then you can consider, similar considerations as an architect has when they design a public space, the same considerations you have in VR and how that may affect how somebody feels. So those are kind of the three main categories: presence around you, around your friends, and the space that you're in. We think that is what contributes the most to how you may feel present.
It makes a lot of sense. And, from a VR perspective, you can start with AR, meaning, it's a mixture of the real environment with augmented data or whatever you want to call it, augmented information, all the way to MR, which is the full environment, the full virtual environment. How is designing for each of those, or even in the future where you're going to be able to go in between, right? Right now, we either have AR or we have VR. But obviously in the future, it looks like, with cameras on the HMDs, you're going to be able to go back and forth or maybe stay in between somewhere where they call MR. How does the design affect that, or what are some of the differences there as a designer you have to take into consideration coming from AR all the way to VR?
I think most of the differences are specific to the platform. Like you may design something for, the HoloLens differently than you do for ARKit or something like that. And those differences will kind of merge, I think, in the future, just like Android and iOS are merging now. I think there are a lot of similarities in the sense that you're designing UI around objects that you can't predict. Especially in AR, you don't know the environment in which something will exist. So your UI or your interactions need to be very fluid in a way that, just like in the web, you have a website that adapts to mobile all the way up to a giant screen. In AR, you may have a design that adapts to different spaces, to an outdoor space, to an indoor, to a low light space, and so on. And I think those concepts are persistent throughout the technologies. I think that the difference might be that in VR, you can control more things than you can in AR. In VR, I can control the entire environment. So I know what, the geometry of the environment is, the lighting and all these things. Well, in AR, it's a bit more unpredictable. And right now, AR is, expressed through a phone. And I think everyone knows that is a temporary step until we get to something that's more immersive. But until we get there, AR is still there's an abstraction between looking at the world through kind of a window that you interact with. So that's something also to keep in mind, is the way you interact with the design or the content or the experience around you. In VR, you may have a bit more of high fidelity interaction where there are some, there's some hardware that allows you to have virtual hands in that space, while AR still has a bit of a way to get there. So we're still kind of relying on old interaction paradigms for AR.
Right, definitely. Now, as a designer, I would assume that this is both exciting and also kind of a nightmare. I mean, especially let's talk about like web VR, right? Where, we're talking about doing websites that are more virtual reality. So, and also that can be more responsive from flat on any device all the way to VR, right? And so as a designer, I would assume from your point of view, it's both exciting, but also kind of like, oh my God, how do we tackle this? Where one design can, fit across not only across all these devices, but go from 2D to full VR.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how you look at it. I think it's kind of a designer's dream, right? Because the actual outcome of it varies so much. The true work is in creating components that are reusable throughout these platforms, right? And that is kind of the bread and butter of design, creating a design system that's scalable and kind of bulletproof. I think that's really exciting, and maybe there's a type of designer that is excited about that, like more like a systems designer or something like that. But I think it is really exciting, and the fact that there's a distinction between 2D design, 3D design, and then VR design, AR, and so on. It seems like a continuum for me, and and thinking about how something would translate from one thing to the other, I think there's a lot of possibilities there that I think are pretty exciting.
And what I'm getting from you is that as a designer, it's very important to have these design principles in place, regardless of the medium, regardless of the device, that guides you throughout your career, right? Once you have those in place, then you can really adjust to whatever new technology or device or whatever.
I think so. Yeah, I think it maybe it's like a pendulum, or I don't know what the right metaphor is, but there's like a binary or like two components. One is a principle that adapts to any platform, and then the other side of the coin is hyper specific knowledge about that platform. So what is something that is specific to the Daydream platform, or something that's specific to ARKit, or specific to HoloLens, or whatever? Each one of them has their own flavor, and I think it's important to be aware of that as you design an experience for that platform, while at the same time kind of referring to these principles that adapt to any platform. And just like today, when you make a product, it's hard to make a product that's for all browsers and for all mobile devices and so on. You kind of focus on, maybe we're going to do something for iOS first. You can apply a similar approach to VR, where you make something for, let's say, the Gear VR first, and then from there you expand to kind of the other kind of idiosyncrasies of the next platform and so on.
Right. That makes sense. So let's get a little more hyper specific, as you said, into design itself. And in your article, you mentioned field of view. So, and how that will affect your UI or UX design. So first of all, why don't we define field of view or explain it so our listeners can understand it better, and then explain how does field of view affect your design? I
might do a crappy job defining it, but the way I referred to it in my article was the way in which you experience content. In VR, content is wrapped around you, and there is no container for that content. And I compared it to AR as of this year, which is experienced through your phone, which you see a lot of really interesting demos on the internet about AR, which are basically videos taken from your phone that you can imagine how immersive they would be if they are, all around you. But the truth is that they're still experienced through your phone. So you're looking through your phone to the rest of the world. And I think that has an effect on your kind of suspension of disbelief, or your willingness to be immersed, where you're looking at something through your phone or through any sort of screen or abstraction, and that kind of allows you to interact with it in ways that are not natural. So if I'm looking at a AR demo through my phone, I can tap the screen and interact with certain objects through my screen. If you look at VR, on the other hand, you don't have a screen. You don't have anything in front of you. So the designer, you need to come up with different ways to allow people to interact with that content, because there isn't a phone or a screen in front of them that allows them to create an abstraction. So as a designer, you can make that decision. You can decide, okay, well, we're going to have a virtual phone or a virtual tablet that they interact with. And that way you'll be kind of reusing a old or a current pattern in the VR world. But I think as the field of view expands and as the way to experience content becomes more and more immersive, it leaves less and less room for abstractions to create like menus or start screens or settings screens and things like that. And you have to figure out how to implement those things within the content itself.
Right. And you actually touch upon that in the article where you talk about content and UI. And you say that there is a line between content and UI. So maybe you can expand on what you mean by that. Like, what is the difference between content and UI?
Sure. Yeah. I think this is especially prevalent in online tools. Like, for example, Facebook. It's a way in which you experience people's content. And as a designer for Facebook, you don't design the content itself. You design the wrapper and the tools you have to access and interact with that content. So if you design newsfeed, you're not in control of what the photos actually look like or what the text actually says, but you're in control of the tools somebody might have to interact with that photo, right? The comment, or a sticker or whatever. So there's this line between what you can do as a designer and the content people are there to see. And when you create tools for people, one of the principles we have is to get out of the way, to design something so that you don't think about the way in which you interact with it. You just kind of interact with it without thinking, which is a good principle. And we created kind of patterns to fulfill that principle. We have like the hamburger menu on the top left of every website. We have pull to refresh. We have pinch to zoom. We have all these things, that abstractions that we have for accessing content, for interacting with content in a way that are kind of abstracted away from the content. Because we have this layer that I was talking about earlier, that you're experiencing all the content through a container, through a screen of some sort. But again, as this layer kind of expands, we kind of lose those abstractions. Like we have to think about, okay, how do I go back? If a website is everything around me, how do I go from one hyperlink to another hyperlink? What is the interaction for that? How do I go back in the stack of websites? How do I access the settings page of a website? How do I put my password? All these things. And all of a sudden they start becoming part of the experience, right? Just like when you go to a movie theater, the seats are kind of part of the whole experience and part of why you decide which movie theater you want to go to. Or, the doorknob is part of the whole house. The way you interact with the house itself becomes part of the experience. So I think we're on our way to do something similar in VR, where a designer needs to make decisions on how to interact and navigate between pieces of content in a way that doesn't take users out, it doesn't take them away from the experience, and they remain immersed as part of a cohesive whole.
And I think one of the perfect examples I think that you covered in your article was, for example, accessing a map. Instead of pressing a button that says map, it's maybe a scroll in their pocket that they pull out, and they literally open it up, unscroll it, and there's the map, right? And then and that would be like in real life where you would grab your map, although today we use Google Maps, but you know what I mean. You grab your map and you travel around as opposed to in a traditional 2D game where you have maybe a button that says map and it brings it up in the screen.
Exactly, yeah.
So your UI is actually the content as well.
Yeah, I cover a lot of games in my article. I play a lot of games. I'm a big fan of them, video games, that is. And I think they're pretty ahead of the rest of the design world because they're kind of tasked with this idea of creating worlds. They want to create something that people are immersed in, and they inhabit the shoes of the character, right? So they've been kind of exercising this way of thinking for quite a few decades by now, and they've come up with pretty clever solutions to things like accessing a map or showing instructions for a certain thing. There's many examples of games that are doing really great things in this regard, and I think you're seeing kind of a revolution of first-person perspective games in the past decade or so that are more and more immersive, and they remove more and more abstractions, right? Like they try to make it so that everything around or everything inside the container of a TV or the monitor or the screen or whatever is what's part of the experience. So removing abstractions from that, I think, is something they've been doing for a while, and something we can learn from as we try to implement those same principles into products that are immersive.
Right. You don't want anything to take you out of that experience, to remind you that you're really not in there.
Exactly.
So you speak also about volumetric UI. Explain what you mean by that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean 3D UI. Coming from graphic design and branding and the 2D product design world, I think we're pretty intimidated by 3D tools. Unity and 3D tools in general are really powerful and really dense. And as someone who's curious about the new technology, learning all those tools becomes a pretty big task. So you have two options as a designer that comes from 2D into VR. You have two options. You either dive in and learn Unity and you become a Unity Jedi or whatever, or you kind of rely on the patterns that you have accrued through the years from 2D design, and you translate those patterns into VR. So for the first year or two of VR, this last VR wave or whatever, for the first while, you saw a lot of 2D UI in VR. You saw a lot of kind of like floating rectangles in space that you point at and you click, and that's how you experience the world. The beginning of Oculus was this way, and many other apps are also this way, which is basically taking, web design conventions, putting it in a giant screen in front of you in VR, and that's something that people are familiar with, something designers are familiar with, so they understand the patterns to take from, and it just allows people to move faster. But I think as we become more and more familiar with the medium of VR, we start to develop an opinion on, to reference the example I was giving earlier, how do you go from one hyperlink to another hyperlink in VR? How do you go back in VR? And you start to develop these patterns on how to do that without creating abstractions. So I think they reference a lot of industrial design in VR nowadays, where there might be a table, and in the table there are buttons that you press, and that feels like there are buttons that are 3D. They live within the world, and that gives kind of like a logic to how things work, and you can kind of intuit how to interact with it. Examples like how to edit let's say a character in VR. We're used to seeing, a bunch of menus with sliders where you tweak the different things about the character's visual properties. You can now kind of figure out how to translate that into a volumetric way. Maybe you're moving let's say you're changing the character's face attributes. Maybe you can directly manipulate it on the face. Maybe you can have physical levers that you pull instead of an abstraction of a lever in 2D. So as we transition into VR and we kind of borrow all these 2D design patterns, I think we're starting to understand what makes VR powerful and how to translate those things kind of one by one in a way that makes the whole experience more cohesive.
And speaking of transition, what should a designer do today to get prepared to transition into designing immersive experiences? What's your recommendation for them?
I think that the technologies will change a lot in the next couple of years. We have headsets coming out every few months, and every headset introduces new variables. And, that's just within VR. AR is seeing its own revolution and so on. So I would recommend not to become too enamored with any sort of particular technology, and instead focus on what the technology brings that no other medium can do. And once you understand what makes VR special, then you can understand how to use VR to solve a real people problem. So you become familiar with this untapped potential of this new medium, and then you figure out how to adapt that to a need that people have in the real world, rather than making something just because it's cool. I talk to a lot of designers who are intimidated by the tools and the nomenclature and the whole world of VR, and I was certainly one of them a few years ago. And I found that it's not very fruitful to focus all your attention into the tool itself, or the platform, or even the medium of VR versus AR, but instead focusing on kind of what that relationship or dynamic between what's unique about VR and what problems people have that VR could address. I think if a designer becomes intimately aware of that, they could withstand whatever change in technology and understand how to adapt it to fit a problem.
I think that's a great tip, because especially today, with the way we are so early on in this new technology boom of VR, things are going to rapidly change. Tools are going to change. Devices are going to change. We're probably going to look at our current HMDs today 5 years from now and probably laugh at it. So I think what you just said is a great tip, because if you get stuck on how to do on what's today, you may not be viable in the future, right?
Yeah, it's just a lot of work, for very little payoff. Like if you're a shading expert in Unity, like I have a lot of respect for you, but as soon as Unity becomes the non-standard, then you need to do all that work to adapt yourself to a different platform, right? So I think that's just my approach to it. I mean, I'm certainly not the best Unity person out there, so there might be other approaches that are equally as or more appropriate. That's kind of the way I take it.
Well, how do you see the job market for immersive designers today?
I mean, I think it's exciting. I think that...
But I mean, is there a lot of work out there for people people with experience, let's say, in this? Or do you see it as a slow starting here?
I think we're going through a bit of a wake-up call where a couple of years there was a lot of excitement and hype that is now, kind of coming to the realization that VR is not going to be the next mobile, at least not for a little while. So we're trying to figure out where to use VR in a way that is still useful and it solves a problem people have, but while acknowledging, the hurdles that you have to go through and the things that are inherent to VR. So that is to say that, as a designer, you need to be aware of that. You need to be aware that it is thrashy. There's a lot of churn and nobody really knows kind of what they're doing. But if you're a designer that gets energized by that and are excited by those types of problems, you could be part of the generation that helps define what that means and what version of VR goes into the mainstream and really kind of like revolutionizes the way we look at content. But you need to kind of approach that with a grain of salt that today we're not quite at, to compare it to mobile, we're not quite at the iPhone level. We're kind of like the Nokia phone level, where there was a lot of interesting work being done there. There was really, really kind of pioneering work that was done in that era. But it is a very different type of work than what we know today, where there's an established app ecosystem and there are hundreds of paradigms and patterns that we can pull from to design an experience. That's not quite what VR is today yet.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Well, Gabriel, we're pretty much out of time. I do want to ask you one last question, which I ask all my guests that appear on the podcast, is what would you like VR to be like in the year 2025 if you had the full power to control it?
Interesting. I am not a fan of... I just don't know of any literature or art or anything that treats a future of VR, AR in a way that is not dystopian. So I like to think of VR as... So for a bit of context, I was born in Cuba and I didn't have access to computers until a bit later on in my life. And I think because of that, I have an appreciation for things like Google Images or Facebook or whatever, these tools that connect the world. And because of Google Images, I was able to see what India was like, right? And before that, I got Microsoft Encarta Encyclopedia, and I just remember seeing, a map of the world and seeing videos of China or whatever, places that I could never even aspire to go to, and experience them through that lens. And I was so grateful for having technology as a conduit for feeding that curiosity. So I imagine VR would be a version of that is enhanced, where if I don't have the means to travel somewhere, I can go there in VR and at least get a sense of what that place is like, what those people are like, just like people get a sense of what that place is like by Googling a place today or doing a Google Images search. So I see in the future the lack of VR as a privilege, like the idea that you can travel wherever you want and you can go to the Amazon or whatever. That to me seems like a privilege, like only a small percentage of humans can do. So I hope that VR can introduce that to a lot more people, introduce what living in other places is like, what meeting other people is like, what, experiencing other cultures and other worlds is like, and do so in a way that is affordable and immersive and engaging. And I think in the next 10 years, we could do that. We could make VR accessible enough that, a kid in India could walk through Times Square and feel like they're there, feel like they have a better sense of what that is like than they would ever do otherwise.
That's a great vision of the future. I appreciate that one much better than the Ready Player One future.
Thank you.
All right, Gabriel. Thanks a lot, man. I really appreciate your time. You've spent a lot of time with us here talking about designing, and I think we all are much better for that. So thank you for appearing on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, man.
So if people want to get a hold of you, do you want to give your URL, your email, whatever you like?
Yeah, I'm Gabriel Valdivia on Twitter, GabrielValdivia.com. You can email me anywhere under that handle. I'm really bad at anonymity, so you can just find me if you figure out how to spell my name.
There you go. All right, Gabriel, thank you so much. And to the rest of you, I'm glad you were here with me. If you enjoy this podcast, please remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and like us on iTunes or SoundCloud. For more episodes, check out howtocreatevr.com/iTunes or howtocreatevr.com/SoundCloud. If you are ever in Southern California area, we have a monthly meetup with lots of great presentations. You can join or RSVP for our next meetup at howtocreatevr.com/meetup. Finally, a quick reminder, howtocreatevr.com brings VR bootcamps to your company to help you and your employees get up to speed on VR. You can learn more at howtocreatevr.com. So until the next episode, I'm your host, Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.